Chapter 42 of The Seventh Most Important Thing by Shelley Pearsall. On Saturday, Arthur went to see Groovy Jim. He didn't really want to go, but he wasn't sure if Groovy Jim had heard about Mr. Hampton, and he wanted to check what was happening with the garage. So she wouldn't worry, he told his mom he was going to the library to look up something for a school project. "What's the project?" she asked. Arthur scrambled to come up with something. "Parts of the cell." His mom didn't look as if she believed him, but she let him go. "Hey, kiddo, you're here early," Groovy Jim said cheerfully when Arthur walked in. He was eating a bowl of popcorn, even though it was only 10 o'clock in the morning. "What's up?" Right then, Arthur knew the guy hadn't heard. Arthur tugged at the front of his hair nervously. Now that he was standing there, he didn't want to be the one to tell Groovy Jim the news. He wasn't even sure how to start. He hated using words like died or passed away. "It's about Mr. Hampton," he said slowly. Groovy Jim looked at Arthur, his face suddenly serious. "What's wrong? Has something happened to him?" When Arthur didn't answer right away, he said, "Geez, oh, Pete, he's gone, isn't he?" "Yes," Arthur mumbled. Standing up, Groovy Jim slowly walked to the front window of his shop. He stood there for a few minutes, shaking his head and rubbing his eyes. "When did it happen?" he asked finally. "Tuesday morning," Arthur answered. "Man, I can't believe it," he said, staring out the window. "I just can't believe it. I hadn't seen Hampton around this week, but I didn't think anything was wrong. That crazy old man was such a good guy. Real good guy." Arthur had no idea why he chose this moment to admit what he'd done to Mr. Hampton, but the confession came pouring out before he could stop it. "You know, I was the kid who hit him last fall," he blurted out. "That's why I was working for him." Groovy Jim's reaction took him by surprise. The guy turned around and gave a sly smile. "Don't worry, kiddo. I knew who you were the minute you walked into my shop back in December. I was in court the day you were sentenced. I drove Hampton to the courthouse, told him I'd be there to support him." Arthur stared at Groovy Jim in disbelief. He'd been in the court the day he was sentenced? He knew the whole story? "Why didn't you ever tell me that?" Groovy Jim shrugged. "You didn't say anything to me, did you? So I guess we all have our secrets, don't we?" Arthur had to admit this was true. There was a lot he'd kept from Groovy Jim. Groovy Jim went back to his chair behind the counter and sat down, still looking shaken up by the news. Finally he said, "Well, thanks for coming here to tell me about Hampton, kiddo. I know it wasn't an easy thing to do." Arthur reached into his pocket for the piece of paper he had brought along. "I have something else to ask you." He glanced in the direction of the garage. "I promised Mr. Hampton I wouldn't let anything happen to his artwork, so I was wondering if you could let me know if someone comes to move it or something," he said, holding out the folded paper. "I wrote my number down here for you." Groovy Jim looked surprised. "Nobody knows what's happening with his stuff?" Arthur shook his head. "No." He tried asking Officer Billy about it. He told Groovy Jim. The day before he'd called to get her again how Mr. Hampton had left some very important projects in his garage and was worried about what would happen to them. But she'd insisted there wasn't much she could do. "Unless Mr. Hampton wrote down his wishes, these things are complicated," she'd said. "So are there any plans for a funeral or a memorial for him?" Groovy Jim asked. Arthur said he'd heard that there were some relatives in South Carolina where Mr. Hampton was from, and he might be buried there, but that was all he knew. Groovy Jim sighed. Too bad he didn't have family here. "Yeah," Arthur agreed. There was a long silence. "So you'll let me know if anything happens, right?" he repeated. Groovy Jim nodded. "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on things. The project meant a lot to Hampton. I know you worked hard on it, too." But Arthur watched nervously as Groovy Jim shoved the folded piece of paper under his cash register drawer. Would he remember where he'd put the number? Would he watch the garage like he said? Would he call? Arthur knew he couldn't be there 24 hours a day. He couldn't stand guard over the artwork. Trust didn't come easily to him, but he had to trust Groovy Jim would do what he said. And a few days later, Groovy Jim kept his promise. "Someone called for you," Arthur's sister announced when he came in from shooting baskets outside. She was mixing a pitcher of Tang in the kitchen. Although he'd only been outside for a short time, she'd already managed to spill powder and ice cubes everywhere. "Who was it?" Arthur asked, getting annoyed by the mess. His sister looked upward. "I think he said his name was Gloomy Jim." It took a minute for Arthur to register what his sister was saying. "You mean Groovy Jim?" She shrugged. "I guess." Arthur's heart began to pound. "What did he say?" "He said you need to come to the garage right away because something is happening." Barbara put her hands on her hips, squinting suspiciously at Arthur. "Who's Gloomy Jim, and what garage is he talking about?" "I'll tell you later," he said. After making his sister promise she'd stay inside while he was gone, he took off running, desperately hoping he wasn't too late.